I'm super pleased to introduce this session. We have the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of King. You probably just saw him on the main stage with Bishop and Van and Abby. He's also the author of Ali, A Life, and he's an incredible guy, an incredible historian, an incredible author. Please welcome to the stage Jonathan Eig. Is this on? Okay, there we go. And our moderator for today from U.S. Bank, an incredible partner of Operation Hope and just a great, great leader. Please welcome the co-leader of Consumer and Business Banking and head of Branch and Small Business Banking, Sekou Kalun.
All right. All right. Yeah, you got to bring your own cheer squad. That's.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, one, it's a pleasure to be here with you. So, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. And yesterday I happened to be at Morehouse College, meeting with the new president, standing in front of King Chapel, and I was thinking about, this session. So the first question that came to my mind, I'm sure it's on the mind of others, there have been many books written about King. Why write a book about King right now? And what was that motivation to do something now?
No, it's a great question. Sometimes we think we know everything about a subject, and when you look a little bit more closely, you realize you don't know much. Like, I asked my kids, well, what do you know about Dr. King? And they would say, well, I have a dream, and he gave a speech and he got shot, right? And when you simplify our history, one of the things that's happened since we created this national holiday and we created a 30-foot monument in Washington, D.C., is that we have simplified his story to the point that he's not really recognizable as a human anymore. And we forget the fact that he was a preacher sometimes. We forget how radical he was, but we also forget his roots. We forget about his family. We forget about the important role Coretta Scott King played in his life. So I thought that it would be worth trying to step back and say, what if I approach this as if we've never heard of this guy? Let me tell you a story about a guy who at 26 years old finds himself living in a town where suddenly the people have decided they're going to stop riding the buses to protest segregation. And he gets a phone call and asks him if he'd come to a meeting, and the guy says, no, I don't want to come to that meeting. I'm too busy. Think about that. You're 26 years old, you're starting a new career, you're new in town, you're getting used to your new church, you've got a 2-week-old baby at home. He's just a guy. And he gets this phone call and says, would you come to a meeting? It's not would you lead the meeting, would you devote your life to this cause that hasn't been invented yet? Would you risk everything for no, it's just, would you come to a meeting? And he says, I think I'm kind of busy. I've got a lot on my plate right now. But then he thinks about it. And he thinks about who he is and what he's been taught all his life and what his religion means to him and what his parents mean to him. And he says, okay, I'll come to the meeting. And that's the beginning. So I wanted to take a man that you think you know really well and just back it up a little bit and say, can you imagine being 26 years old and having this opportunity, but this sacrifice that you're going to have to make, and what happens after that from that point on? So, I was very lucky to begin at a point when there were still hundreds of people alive who knew Dr. King. That's what really got me started. I met Dick Gregory.
Oh, yeah.
And Dick Gregory was telling me about when King visited him in jail in Cook County in Chicago. And I was like, wait, you knew Martin Luther King. Like, just tell me what he was like. Tell me what that guy was like. And that's where it began for me, realizing that there was an opportunity, maybe the last opportunity, to interview hundreds of people who knew Dr. King and say, tell me about that guy.
Yeah, so I like what you've done there. They're digestible, simple sound bites that now really capture who he is, unfortunately, in our history books. What you already alluded to was there was greater complexity by taking this step back and rethinking who the man was. So what then surprised you the most about the research you did? You started to allude to, again, some of that early story, but are there things that really stood out to say, like, this isn't something that's been part of the dialogue, or this was a source of motivation that many people don't know?
Let me answer that in two different ways, the small and the big. There were so many small things that surprised me about King that I learned along the way. The fact that as an adolescent, he twice attempted suicide, that he struggled with mental health issues all of his life, that you would read about him being in the hospital, like when he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Nobody even really noticed this, but when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, reporters are looking for him. They call his house in Atlanta, and Curtis says, oh, well, he's in the hospital. Why was he in the hospital? Because he was depressed. He was exhausted. He couldn't sleep. And when Coretta called him to say, hey, guess what? You won the Nobel Peace Prize, he was in a daze. He'd taken all these sleeping pills. He thought he was dreaming. So let's step back and take a look at some of these small things that help us remember that he was human, that he and his best friend Ralph Abernathy wore the same cologne and the same brand of shoes and took their kids to the YMCA to go swimming together. Let's embrace some of those really small personal details that remind us that he was a person. The fact that he, plagiarized, pretty much all his life from starting in high school. I discovered that he entered a public speaking contest as a junior in high school, a statewide competition for black students. Competition was in Macon, Georgia, and he finished third. First of all, Martin Luther King finishes third in a public speaking contest. Those other two kids must have been really good. But then I discovered that he completely plagiarized his speech, and he went on to plagiarize. So let's understand that. Where does that come from? He's from a preacher's background. His father, his grandfather, even when they were enslaved, his ancestors were preaching. So he had a different idea of what it meant to borrow sources. Borrowing from other sources was something that you did with pride. So those are some of the little things that I wanted to accentuate. And then there's a couple of really big things that I thought were important to bring out in this book. Number one, we did not fully appreciate just how sinister the U.S. government was in their campaign to destroy him. And that it did not begin even in the last few years of his life. It followed him his entire career. When he gave the speech at the March on Washington, the pinnacle of his life in many ways, right? The greatest speech of the 20th century. And it's a moment when America begins, you heard Van Jones say this, it's a moment when King is offering us a new future. And even the white mainstream media says, we have an opportunity today to move beyond 300 years of second-class citizenship, to move beyond the sin of slavery, and to become one nation. And people begin to really believe it. I interviewed people for this book who decided to integrate their factory floors the day after the March on Washington. Wow. I interviewed a man who decided that it was time to put his picture of his wife on his desk, a white man who was married to a black woman who was ashamed to tell his coworkers until that moment. But the same day, August 29th, 1963, the FBI produces a memo that says, given King's powerful speech at the March on Washington, we must now rate him the most dangerous man in America. Wow. And they ramp up their campaign to destroy this man. They begin wiretapping his home phones, his office phones. They begin putting listening devices in his hotel rooms. And it's not just the racist J. Edgar Hoover. It goes way beyond that. RFK approves the wiretaps, JFK approves them, and LBJ doubles down on them. LBJ, while trying to create this great society, while working with King hand in hand to try to pass Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, he's stabbing King in the back at the same time. He's reaching out to shake his hand with one hand and he's stabbing him with the other, encouraging J. Edgar Hoover to release this material to the media from King's sexual affairs. So King is under an unbelievable amount of pressure. The government that he's trying to work with is also trying to destroy him. And I just think that we as a country have not reckoned with the fact that the same country that today celebrates him with a national holiday was actively trying to destroy him. So I felt like it was very important in this book to bring out some of those facts that we sort of sweep under the rug intentionally.
I think that's a good point, because what you're reflecting on is his humanity, which is something we all share. But why is it then important to cover some of those complex things when speaking about the broader legacy? Like, how do you think about that, some of the challenging things in his past, and why that context or fuller picture matters? Like, what was your motivation of kind of highlighting that? Well,
I was worried a little bit about how people would react to a book that talked about King's failures, his flaws, in particular his extramarital affairs. But I felt like he was great enough, and we were sophisticated enough and understanding enough, empathetic enough that we could still love the man and perhaps even love him more. And I can't tell you how many people have come to me, this book has been out almost 2 years now, have come to me in tears saying, I didn't know how much he suffered. I didn't know how hard life was for him. I didn't know how depressed he was at times. And I love him and admire him more than ever. So I was confident that readers would embrace this nuanced version of King. And I think it's really important that we not sugarcoat these stories, if we want to be inspired by these people, if we want to encourage people to try to stand up and be activists, we can't demand perfection. And I think that, as I said earlier today, if we want our heroes to be perfect, we won't have any heroes. And mostly the reaction has been very good. And it's interesting, Jesse Jackson called me when the book came out, and I interviewed him 3 or 4 times for the book, and he said, I don't know why you needed to put all that stuff about his personal life in there. And I said, let's talk about it. And I went down to his office and we had a discussion about this very issue. And Andrew Young called me when the book came out and said, I'm really glad you included all of that. You handled it sensitively, you didn't overdo it, you didn't sensationalize it, but it was true. And Andrew Young saw it probably closer than anybody in the world. He was, at that point, late in the last 5 years of his life, I don't think anybody was spending more time with Dr. King than Andy Young. And he said that, Dorothy Cotton, for example, was just like a lifesaver to Dr. King. And that he doesn't know how King would have, so Dorothy Cotton deserves to be honored for that, not shamed. And I don't think it's a shame, I don't think it's shaming King either to say that that he had moments of weakness, that he did things that he wasn't proud of, but this is what he had to do to survive.
Yeah, it's amazing though that, as you point out, the government would use some of that information, whether it's sharing with Coretta or just generally trying to denigrate or sully his character so that people wouldn't follow. But despite that, he created this global movement. And so when you think about it, and you mentioned some of the word like radical, he was around economics, some of the speeches beyond just I Have a Dream, where he talks about what had been done. The famous quote, you want us to pull ourselves up from the bootstraps when we don't have bootstraps. Like, talk about like that legacy around military, economics, et cetera, and what lessons do we pull forward today?
Yeah.
Where we are today, like some of that same message, the March for Jobs, or March on Washington, and again, the economic, the military messaging. How should we think about that in today's context?
That's a great question, and I think it's really important to remember that it was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom,
yeah.
And that he did talk a lot about economic inequality. That was really what the speech was about until he suddenly decided that he wanted to do his dream sermon because it felt like time to go to church. But that was really the message that carried him through the last 5 years of his life. And I think that's partly why he became more controversial, because a lot of folks were saying, hey, we just gave you the vote. We just desegregated all those lunch counters. You're good now, right? Stop bothering us. And, there's this immediate backlash. Like, why is he asking us for more? And King said, well, you gave us the vote and you desegregated the lunch counters. That hasn't cost you a dime. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, you're segregated too. Just because we passed these laws that are going to force Birmingham to desegregate doesn't mean we're going to ignore the de facto segregation in the North. And all of this made him less popular. And I think you could really argue that it's the economic issues that pushed America over the edge in their feelings toward Dr. King. When he starts talking about capitalism and restructuring capitalism and talking about things like guaranteed income, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed health care, daycare, that's when he starts to lose a lot of his financial support. He starts to lose a lot of his political support. And when he gets around to the Vietnam War, forget about it. America's ready to be done with him. And what's so impressive about this is that he sees the big picture. He sees that unless we, and he says it over and over again, unless we address economic inequality in this country, giving us the right to vote isn't going to matter. We have to look at the fundamental core issue that is affecting not just black lives, but all lives, that it becomes a human rights struggle, not a civil rights struggle. And his popularity plummeted as a result of that. And it's fascinating, the FBI wiretaps are really revealing in this way, because we can read the phone calls. We don't have the audio yet, we only have the transcripts. But Andrew Young told me that the transcripts are accurate. He read his conversations that the FBI was recording, and he says that's exactly what I said. So they were transcribing the conversations accurately. But what you see is that by 1968, King is now planning the Poor People's Campaign.
Yes. Yeah.
He's going to bring thousands of people,
Black and white,
from all over the country to occupy Washington, D.C. You know, I'm always amused. You see people today saying, oh, Dr. King would never shut down a highway. Dr. King would never disrupt the operations of government. He did it all the time, and he was planning his biggest disruption of them all. He was going to occupy Washington, D.C., bring the government to a shutdown if necessary, until we addressed the fundamental inequalities that are baked into capitalism. And if you want to call him a socialist for that, fine. But what he was really saying was that we need to look at some of the things that just aren't working. And that's when you start to see the American government turning even harder against him. J. Edgar Hoover issues another memo in the spring of 1968, just months before King's assassination, that says King is the only one, Malcolm X is dead, King is the only one left who might become the Messiah, and we must do everything in our power to keep that from happening.
Wow. And just think about that, where at a moment of bringing people together,
Right.
he became more of a threat. Have you as you look at the civil rights era more broadly, are there any things where the things that you're trying to advocate for, that is the intersectionality, poverty is poverty, no matter who's experiencing it, like what do you make of, again, that intense scrutiny by the government post that movement, and what role do you feel that could have played in the assassination?
Well, it's
easy question.
No, it is. It actually is an easy question.
Not on the script either, but go ahead.
No, but why would the American government, why would J. Edgar Hoover or LBJ or members of the Senate, members of the media, why would they be afraid of Malcolm and Martin coming together, or Malcolm and Stokely Carmichael coming together? Why would they be afraid that the March on Washington might actually make people want to erase the systemic racism that's built into our system? Well, it's because it might mean they have to give up the power. The people who've been hoarding power in this country for 300 years might have to share it. Why would they want to do that? Why would J. Edgar Hoover sees his job as protecting the status quo? The status quo has been very good to him and people like him, and King presents a threat to his vision of the world. Unfortunately, you know, he had the power to maintain his vision of the world as long as he possibly could, and nobody was willing to stand up to him. So I think the answer is pretty simple, why the government treated him as a foe, because he represented a new vision of what America could be, and they were scared of that vision.
And we talk about this conference and future-proofing, all right? So again, we've seen some throughout history, some of the same themes can reemerge. Like, how should we pull some of your insights forward as we think about where we are, the here and now?
Well, I think everyone in this room is doing it. The fact that you're here is a pretty good sign that you're doing it. I think one of the ways that we future-proof is by looking at the past. We have a tendency today, I think our kids don't know history at all, and we have a tendency to treat history and to teach history as if it's just a bunch of names and dates that have to be memorized. And history is not like that. History is running through our lives. The impact of King's life is running through everything that's happening in our society today. When King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, we had a choice as a nation how to respond to that assassination. We could have, as a society, decided that we need to embrace his teachings. We need to follow through on the things he was working toward, like reducing income inequality. Instead, we responded with police shutting down our cities and arresting protesters. And that's still often our response to protest, to fights for justice. So I think the way we future-proof is by remembering the past and remembering the sacrifices that our ancestors made for us to be here today. Yeah. And not just choosing the version of the story that makes us comfortable. You know, we, as I said, you know, an hour ago, and we teach the second half of the I Have a Dream speech, but not the first half. At the King Memorial in Washington, D.C., last time I visited a couple of years ago, his books weren't for sale in the gift shop until I complained, and now they are for sale.
Wow.
Because King's words are radical. King's words challenge us to question our assumptions and to question the status quo. And they include a sort of radical Christianity that makes a lot of us uncomfortable. So I think that we can future-proof by not ignoring the past.
And I want to stick with that notion of the past as you think about the interviews you did or information you may have gathered. I think about what it would be like to be the fly on the wall. So some conversations between Martin and Malcolm, did you have any of those fly on the wall moments as you at least reading transcripts or doing interviews that it's like, wow, I didn't know these, titans, had so much alignment here or really disagreed there. Are there any things that stood out for you based on a lot of those conversations?
Yeah, there were a lot of things like that. And first of all, just being able to interview people who knew King, like Ambassador Young, or like his lawyer, Fred Gray in Alabama. Sometimes, I felt like I had this great opportunity. I was maybe the last one to do it, and I would get a little, as I got to know them, I got more comfortable. I would ask more personal questions, I asked Attorney Gray, what did Dr. King smell like, But I'm always asking people, what is it like to be in the room? What was it like to be in the car with him? And when it comes to certain things like these important conversations, like with Malcolm X, we have to go back to these direct sources. We have to go back to the primary sources as often as we can. That's why it's important to have these historical documents, to have these archives. I mentioned the FBI transcripts. There's a transcript of King speaking to one of his closest friends and associates, Stan Levison, right after his speech on April 4th, 1967 at the Riverside Church, when he gave one of his most radical speeches, and it was one of his most religious speeches, and explained why he had to oppose the Vietnam War and why he had to speak out on income inequality, because it's rooted in his faith. And he says, I'm not an activist, I'm not a politician, I'm a minister, and my job is to save souls, and we can't save souls unless we address militarism and materialism. And after this speech, which was panned in the New York Times and panned in the Washington Post, one of his closest friends, Stan Levison, calls him. And I'm reading the transcript of this conversation. And Levison says, that speech was terrible. This is somebody who King talks to almost every day, someone who knows him so well, someone he really trusts. And Levison says, that was a terrible speech. It's going to really hurt our fundraising. It's going to shut off our access to the White House. It's going to make it impossible for us to do the kind of work we're trying to do in the South. And King has to say to one of his closest friends, don't you know who I am at this point? Wow. And I'm reading these words in the transcript, it's word for word. And he says, what I said may have been politically unwise, but it was not morally unwise. And for King, in 1967, to still have to explain himself to one of his closest friends, I was in tears. This is a man who he's won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he still has to explain himself even to his friends. He feels alone. He feels like no one's listening to him anymore. And it's just heartbreaking. The other thing I'll mention, the other really interesting discovery I made is, we've seen, and this is the government's work in part, we've seen Malcolm X and Martin Luther King described as rivals. And they were at times. Malcolm X used Dr. King. A lot of people use Dr. King to say, I'm the more dangerous alternative. If you don't listen to this nonviolent guy over there, I'm going to come at you. And it was very effective. And Malcolm played that. But by the end of their lives, they were really coming together in many ways. And Martin Luther King never really talked very much about what he thought about Malcolm X. But there's one quote in Playboy magazine, an interview by Alex Haley. And wow. King says in this magazine, I think Malcolm X's fiery oratory is terrible for America, for black men, for black America, that he's doing nothing but causing harm. So because I take 6 years on a book, I leave no stone unturned, I wanted to read the entire interview to see what got left out. So I went to the library at Duke University where Alex Haley's papers are kept, and I asked for the tape. They didn't have the tape, they had the transcript. They had all of his typed transcripts of his interview. And there were lots and lots of things that didn't make it into print. But what I found was that when King was asked what he thought about Malcolm X in this interview, he never said that. When he was asked what he thought about the Nation of Islam, he said, I think the Nation of Islam's fiery oratory is doing nothing but damage to black America. When he was asked about Malcolm X, he said, now listen, Malcolm X and I are fighting for the same thing, black dignity. And we have more in common than we have in opposition. And I disagree with any calls for violence, but I think Malcolm and I, the magazine changed the quote. Wow. So that just goes to show you the impact of this movement to try to destroy King, that the media was in and out. Even a black journalist felt like he had to do what would be more controversial, what would stoke sell more copies, or maybe it was his white editors doing it, we don't know. But it's so important that we not repeat history without questioning it, without asking questions.
And that's fascinating. And I think back to a couple years ago, some of you may know Sojourner Truth, the Ain't I a Woman speech. Well, that speech that many of you know and read was a speech that was written after the fact and published in a white newspaper. But there was a black newspaper that actually captured, around the time after her speech, the actual speech. And it's the same notion. When you read the two speeches, you could Google it. It blows your mind. One of the speeches was changed vernacular to make it sound like it had to come from Sojourner Truth. So that's fascinating. And speaking of speeches, Martin Luther King's incredible speeches that you were talking about Riverside, I was thinking about the stabbing where the blade was close to his heart, and then he got a letter from a student at White Plains. So he talks about this speech. I got a letter from the president, I put it aside, and there's just one student. She wrote back, "I'm so glad you didn't sneeze," because if he had sneezed,
right,
the blade would have killed him. And so when you think about how he pulled in like the real life trauma that he experienced, and would weave it into a message. Like, how did that impact you? Not only the transcripts, but speeches, and again, you talked about some of the early on, some of the plagiarism, but a lot of what he did was really connecting life to what the movement was about and the impact he wanted to have. Do anything stand out beyond the traditional speeches for you, or that you would encourage us to listen to other speeches?
Yeah, first of all, there are books of his published speeches. They're really worth reading. And I think King was happiest and most comfortable in the pulpit, especially in the church, not just speaking to an audience at a university or something like that, at a political rally. When he was in the church, in front of an audience on a Sunday morning, I think that was his happiest place, which is why at the March on Washington, he goes into this speech that becomes one of his sermons. He's done with his printed material, and he just says it's time to do a sermon. But the speech you were mentioning, where he talks about, it's the only time he ever talked about this in a speech. He repeated his sermons a lot. There were certain ones he must have given dozens of times. But that speech, the last speech of his life at Mason Temple in Memphis, the day before his assassination, was a speech he'd never given before. Yeah. It was totally improvised. He was in bed in his pajamas, and Abernathy and Jesse Jackson were down at Mason Temple. It was a rainy night. King wasn't feeling well. And
that's the mountaintop.
The mountaintop speech. King, they called him and said, "You got to come down here. These people do not want to hear from Abernathy. They want you." And he goes down there, and some people think that he was suicidal at this point. Some people think that he knew the end was coming. I mean, it's amazing to think that this is the sermon he gives the night before his death. But he says, first of all, he talks about the letter he got. He was stabbed in the chest, and he could have died. If he'd sneezed, he would have died. And he says, if I had died, I would have missed these extraordinary times, these years where we have challenged white racism, we have challenged American government, we have challenged democracy to be something better. If I had lived in ancient Greek times, nothing would compare to these years that I have seen, the progress that I've seen our people make. And while I'd like to live a long life, longevity has its blessings.
Yeah, blessings, yeah.
It doesn't matter for me now. I only want to do God's will. Yeah. And I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. And he practically collapses into Abernathy's arms at the end of that speech. Abernathy said he'd never seen King so emotional. And I still get goosebumps just thinking about it, because this is a man who, I think he processed his thoughts and feelings when he was giving a sermon. I think he felt touched by God in that moment, and the words were coming from someplace special.
Yeah, so again, I could keep talking, but I do want to open it up. We have a lot of people here that may have questions, but just tremendous insights, and it just is a reflection that we don't have to be perfect to make the impact that we want to have. And so, and that's fascinating. So we're going to open it up for questions. I think there will be a mic. There's a question in the back, and then we'll come to the front.
Hi. Wow, that's a great question. Thank you for that. As I said earlier, I try to go into this as if I knew nothing about the subject, with a really open mind. Like, I don't know who this guy is. I'm going to find out. I'm going to do everything I can. I'm going to spend 6 years every day. I don't do anything else. I don't teach. I don't pay any attention to my wife and kids. I just do this for 6 years. And I'm going to learn things about this man that he didn't know about himself. When I wrote my book about Muhammad Ali, I discovered that his grandfather was a convicted murderer. Muhammad Ali didn't know that. I told him about that. And I discovered that his great-great-great-grandfather was an escaped slave who became a hero as a spy for the Union. Like, I'm learning things about King that he didn't know about himself. I'm just going with an open mind, and I'm hoping that I'm going to still like the guy at the end. And I think what moved me most about King, personally, was I was not prepared. I don't think I'd ever encountered anybody who had that level of faith, who felt like God spoke to him and he was prepared to give up his life for what God meant to him and taught him. And I believe in God. I'm a little bit religious, but and then I was spending time with people like Ambassador Young, like Reverend Jim Lawson, who shared this kind of passion and this faith, who were trying to explain to me. I was not really prepared for that. And to try to understand how somebody would be willing to sacrifice their life for something they believe in. It wasn't for segregation, for integration. It wasn't for, getting a law passed. It was for his faith in God. And that absolutely changed the way I think of the world and made me think about, I may never have that kind of a faith, but I feel like we all have a sense of responsibility to think about what's bigger than us and what we can do as a part of a community that makes the world a better place, whether that comes from your religion or whether that comes from your love of humanity, whatever touches you in that way. But to have something you believe in that strongly is really inspiring to me. It's something I think about all the time.
Great, thank you. Up front here, and then here, and then Milan.
Thank you. Just leafing through it, I can't wait to read it. It's beautiful. I have two competing questions. I'll tell you both and let you pick. One is what you said about his faith. I would love to know just a little bit more about that. What were the roots of that? Were there any private moments where it's like, really, God? And how did he find the strength to follow that calling to his death ultimately, and no matter what, and at all costs? I think that's the more important. The second question would just be, what was it like to write the book and your writing process? So but I think...
Well, as far as King's faith goes, it's very important to remember that he had a father and a grandfather who were preachers. He was steeped in this culture, but until the rubber hits the road, you don't know how you're going to respond. And when his home was bombed early on in the Montgomery bus boycott, remember, he wasn't sure he wanted this job. He ends up being asked to be the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And then within just a couple of weeks, his home is bombed. And he's got a month-old baby there. His wife and his baby are in the house when it's bombed. He comes rushing home. And first of all, it's Coretta who says, "We're not leaving. We're not going to let them intimidate us." Coretta's father comes to town and says, you're coming home with me. And Coretta says, "No, we're staying right here." So he had support. He had a wife who believed as much as he did, who believed in the cause, believed in him. And then as it persisted, remember, Klan membership doubled when the Montgomery bus boycott began. The mayor and the police chief joined the Klan. The telephone operator, back in those days, you had to plug in a call. They just kept plugging in his phone line all night long so he couldn't sleep. And one morning at 2 a.m, he's pacing the floors of his tiny little parsonage where he lived on Jackson Avenue in Montgomery, and he's drinking coffee and doesn't know what to do, thinks like this is stupid, it's dangerous. He said he heard God speak to him, and that he heard God's voice saying, keep going. You're doing the right thing. And that carried him for the rest of his life.
Wow, that's really beautiful. Thank you. And is there anything you can share with us about the writing process? And
the writing process to me is I don't even think about writing until I'm several years into my project, till I feel like I know this person. I always say you have to know what the book's about in one word before you can begin writing it, or else you're wasting your time. And this book was about love.
Yeah, one quick thing, because I always think about the progress, even though, there's progress to be made. If you think about Montgomery, you just referenced it, in Birmingham, both cities have African-American mayors, Stephen
Right.
Reed in Montgomery,
Right.
Randall Woodfin in Birmingham, both Morehousemen.
Yeah.
But there are signs of the progress that we're making. To think what was the cradle of the Confederacy,
Yeah.
to have now, African-American mayors leading the charge is fascinating. Malji, then Milan. And
Thank
then
you so much.
After that.
I'm really curious to know, how has the current administration reacted or responded to the book? What has your experience been like with the current administration?
Oh, I think Trump has read it several times. He has a big stack of them.
Got a picture version in there.
Yeah, on his desk, and everybody who comes in his office gets a King book and a MAGA hat.
They do quote him a lot, though, so it is a fascinating question.
No, he's been a disaster for civil rights, for Black history. He and his administration are trying to fight DEI. They're trying to fight Black history. They're pulling books from libraries. I think that I've had no reaction whatsoever from anyone in the administration. I don't think, he in his first term, he pulled King's statue out of the Oval Office. So I don't think that this book is anywhere on their radar, unfortunately. I don't think history is on their radar. I don't think the arts are on their radar. I think that, this is a dangerous, frightening time for history, for America, for free thought, for justice. And I don't think that, I think like I said, we need King's words again to remind us that we are not a society that wants to hate one another. I think we are not a society that wants to be driven by fear. King said that we must stay open to change, and we must never lose infinite hope. And I think that's the message that we need right now.
So there, with the mic, Milan, then you, and then I'll begin to.
Excellent.
And
Thank
we'll get you too. So go ahead.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, it's amazing to be here with you, to hear these perspectives and to see that insight. At first blush, I thought, why are we sharing those points of view? But the reality is, to your point, I think it's inspiring to see and to hear those things. So my question is, I remember the day that Dr. King was assassinated. I remember the pain and the agony on my mom's face. I remember the tears and that embrace that almost strangled me as she rocked and she cried. I remember that moment. So my granddaughter, who's a senior in high school, wants to be a history teacher. She's going and pursuing history. And so the vantage point, we have this revisionist history, we have the actual history, but then what is your hope? I know my hope for her. I want her to grab a hold of a history that's going to make a difference for the future. What is your hope when we're sharing this book with a 17, 18-year-old, and what do you hope that they would do with it as it relates to future posterity and impact?
That's a great question, and I have kids. One kid's still in high school, one just graduated from college, and I don't feel like they're as aware of the past as they should be, and I think that we need to do a better job teaching history. I hope that your daughter helps in that cause. But I think, as I said earlier, part of the problem is that we just teach stuff you got to memorize. We don't teach how it affects our lives today. And I think that if we, for example, ask people to read the first half of the I Have a Dream speech and just have them guess who wrote it. They're going to say Malcolm X. They're not going to say Martin Luther King. Right? There are ways to to engage with history in a way, even for the kids on TikTok, that it can be relevant to their lives. And I just think we have to, fight against that tendency to treat history as if it's just a bunch of stuff you got to know to pass your class, and show how it really filters in our lives today.
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to say excellent moderation. And I want to say personally thank you to U.S. Bank for their involvement. It takes a lot of leadership. Most people don't recognize how difficult it is because of the schedule that you actually have to come and support the organization. It says a lot. To you, Mr. Eig, I want to. Mr. Eig, you've written about some very interesting people, from Ali to Jackie Robinson, Dr. King, Lou Gehrig, Capone. I'm really curious, since you really go deep with your subject, you must have learned some things, like you said, that other people don't even know, whether it's the subject themselves or even their family. I'm curious to know, what are some adjectives you would use to describe each of the subjects that you wrote about that most people wouldn't know?
Wow.
And also, you've written about people, the majority of your works, instead of like, points in time, World War II. You've written about people. What is it about people that fascinates you, and who's going to be the subject that you write about next?
Oh, good question. So I think each subject I find something really deep and surprising, and not just little things about like what kind of cologne they wore, but like Lou Gehrig was incredibly shy and was scared of girls until he was in his 30s, and his wife kind of just like dragged him by the collar. Jackie Robinson was a really difficult guy to talk to, just not good at small talk. Like Muhammad Ali, I can't even, like, so many surprises, and not all of them positive, right? So I spend all this time with these people, and you learn to just, like, you can't help but fall in love with them, and I end up talking about them for the rest of their lives. And little things just stay with you. And like Martin Luther King had this habit of answering people's questions when they would come up to him after church and say, "Oh, Dr. King, I'm having a hard time with." His first word always was yes. Like if Coretta said, I want to go to that march. I wish we could get a baby. Yes. His first word was always yes. And I'm so struck by that. It was just like a habit, but it was a really positive habit. Instead of saying well, which is how a lot of us begin our sentences, he began with yes, an affirmation, right? And I just think that that's partly why he was such a good listener. And King was a great listener. So I think that I try to look for the little things that help, provide a window into who this person really was. And I think I may be forgetting the second question, the part of your question.
Who you would write?
Who am I writing next?
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to write about people. I'm not trained as a historian. I'm an old journalist. Writing biographies is I thought it would be easy because it's chronological. They're born, they die, fill in everything in between, and you got your book done. And it just struck me as an easier way to teach history. And I think for people who are scared of history, biography is a great way in. I don't really want to read a whole book about the Civil War, but I'll read a book about Lincoln or Grant. And biography just works that way for me. So I'm now writing a book about George Soros. And I think he's 95 years old, he's still alive. It's a book about the century of the struggle against authoritarianism, really. This is a guy who's born in Nazi Germany, survives the Holocaust, then ends up spending $35 billion of his own wealth to try to fight communism, helped to break up the Soviet Union, and becomes one of the most hated men in the world because he's funding so many progressive liberal causes. And it seems to be backfiring, right? Now he's the boogeyman that has helped strengthen some of these authoritarian regimes by attacking Soros. So I think you can use his life. I'm not going to, I would not feel comfortable writing a book about the century of totalitarianism, but I think by focusing on Soros, I can tell you a story that's about more than just the man.
So rapid fire, young man in the black, young lady in the black, and those will be our last questions. So right there with the hat, and then you back there.
Okay, got a question for you that I have to ask. But this is supposed to be one of the greatest, definitive, books on the life of King. You said you wrote on Muhammad Ali as well. As a white man, what gave you the boldness to say to yourself that, like, I'm going to be the one to tell this story, and tell it most accurately as it has to be? Is it like a sense of calling or purpose to say, hey, like, we need to get this out here and get it right? Or, what gave you the strength to be able to do that?
That's a great question. And I think there's a fine line between boldness and stupidity. I'm straddling that line. No, I did feel like in both of these cases that I was positioned to do something important, And I do feel like it was a responsibility that Martin Luther King needed a new biography. There had not been a biography since 1982. And that's just wrong. It's sinful. We need to reevaluate his life each era, each generation, because it speaks to us in a different way. And I felt like I already had Jesse Jackson and Andrew Young and John Lewis in my phone. I knew their numbers. I could call them and say, would you help me? I wouldn't do this if they wouldn't help me. And I was concerned about whether a white man should be writing the book or whether a black man should be doing it. But Harry Belafonte and Dick Gregory said to me, you need to do it now, because the witnesses aren't going to be around much longer. And don't worry about whether you're exactly the right person to do it. Do your best and take a shot at it. And then I called a lot of the leading black historians too and asked them if they would help me, because I felt like as a white man I had more blind spots. I had more obstacles to overcome, more prejudices that I had to work through. So I asked for help, and I had people like Lewis Baldwin, the theologian, reading chapters for me so that I would have support. I had people like Peniel Joseph reading chapters for me, giving me feedback so that whatever disadvantages I had as a white man, I might be able to make up for it to some extent. So I just recognized my own weaknesses and tried to overcome them, but realizing that there's no perfect biographer. Everybody's going to have their blind spots. I just have to do my best. So I think it put extra pressure on me, made me work a little harder, and I hope I earned the privilege of telling the man's story.
All right, last quick question, then we're over. So right there, the young lady in the black.
Hello. So my question is, just like the young lady up here mentioned about how Martin Luther King was so close to God, and how you mentioned he felt that he was hearing from God and this mission was something that the Lord was calling him on. And I know you mentioned that you were religious to a certain extent, so I would like to know, how did literally walking out his testimony, hearing his testimony of his relationship with God, did that bring you closer to God? Did you feel like God was guiding you while you was writing this book? Did you have situations where you felt like, okay, like he said, like almost an unction or a calling or a purpose to tell this story and to tell it in such a way? Like, did it bring you closer to God?
Yeah, it absolutely did. And I'm going to tell you a story that I don't know if I've ever told this story before, but I got to the end of the book and I was writing this, and something happened as I was writing this. I wrote, "In hallowing King, we've hollowed him. From Montgomery to Chicago, along those streets named Martin Luther King Drive and Martin Luther King Avenue and Martin Luther King Highway, poverty and segregation rates remain much higher than local and national averages. In schools named for King, King's life and lessons are smoothed and polished beyond recognition. On my most recent visit to the King Memorial in Washington, D.C., I found none of King's books for sale in the gift shop. Our simplified celebration of King comes at a cost. It saps the strength of his philosophical and intellectual contributions. It undercuts his power to inspire change." A little bit. "Where do we go from here? In spite of the way America treated him, King still had faith when he asked that question. Today, his words might help to make our way through these troubled times, but only if we actually read them. Only if we embrace the complicated King, the flawed King, the human King, the radical King. Only if we see and hear him clearly again, as America saw and heard him once before. Our very survival," he wrote, "depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change." And then I typed, period, closed quotes, "Amen." Wow. And I was like, oh my God, did I just type amen? I sat there and I said, I just typed amen. Like, where did that come from? I can't do that. Wait, can I? Can I end my book as a prayer? The book begins with a quote from the Bible, which I didn't plan it this way. Like, it begins with, "They said to one another, 'Behold, this dreamer cometh. Let us slay him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. Genesis 37, chapter 19 and 21. And then it ends with amen. And I don't know if I've ever heard God speak to me, but amen.
And that is a fitting way to end. So thank you so much. This was Truly incredible. Thank you. Thank you.
Appreciate that. That was great.